Hi, Misha here, and at the beginning of April 2021, we have a few new batches of Hobby Masters. And this is an aircraft variant that I've wanted to pick up for a very long time. I nearly picked up a model from Witty Wings or a few others, but I'm really glad I waited till Hobby Master came out. This is a 1/72 scale diecast model of the Lockheed F-104S Starfighter. And this is the final variant in the very colorful Starfighter series. And it was flown by the Italian Air Force and also the Turkish Air Force. And the Starfighter is one of my favorite Century series planes. It's so different. And I've had this one here, also a Hobby Master. This is an F-104A, originally flown by the U.S. Air Force, gifted to Taiwan around 1959. So this is a first production version in military service. And so I thought it would be nice to knock a thing off. Great. Yeah, I haven't glued them yet. Anyway, I thought it would be nice to have the final version. I also have an F-104J that I've shown you from Japan, and a few others, including the Canadian. There's some interesting variants in this. So with that, I thought we would just talk about the differences and kind of what makes this a unique version. It's been a little while since I've done a big Starfighter video, so now that I have several new variants, I probably will. But just, this was a very interesting craft born out of the needs of Korea. And from Kelly Johnson, the Skunk Works at Lockheed. And while many 1950s and 1960s jets were getting bigger and bigger and bigger, the Starfighter was essentially an engine with an airframe wrapped around it. And then I think they realized late in production, or late in design, that they also needed to make room for a pilot and maybe some weapons. So they squeezed some on. And early versions, you had the wingtip fuel tanks, which were optional, but really necessary because the wings themselves couldn't hold any fuel. They were too thin. So you only had the fuselage tank. And this actually used the J-79 engine, later made famous by the Phantom. And it had these two hard points under the fuselage there for a couple of sidewinders. It also had an M61 20mm cannon. This was a hot rod. It could go well over Mach 2. It had a very high altitude. But it also sacrificed in terms of range, and sometimes turning was a little problematic. It liked going fast in a straight line. And there were some early development issues, and it always remained kind of a temperamental aircraft to fly. And while the U.S. Air Force only flew the Starfighter for a relatively brief time, a lot of NATO allies operated it for years and decades. Germany might be the most famous foreign user. It had its own variant, the F-104G. Canada also had a licensed version. And Italy, too, flew the F-104G in the mid-60s. But they wanted a new dedicated interceptor, all-weather. And so they were holding trials in 1965. They were kind of taking a look at different aircraft. From the USA, they looked at the F-4C Phantom. They also looked at the North American F-100 Super Sabre. And from Europe, they looked at the BAC Lightning out of the UK, as well as the French Mirage 3. But in the end, they went with this airplane. This started off at Lockheed, internally known as the Super Starfighter. And in January 1966, Italy decided to go with it, kind of sticking to a little bit of what they knew. And the first prototype was actually created by modifying an Italian-produced F-104G, and that flew in December of that same year, 1966, with the second prototype flying in February of 1967. And then they would gear up for production, and most of these would be constructed at FIAT in Italy. By the end of 1968, the first production model was ready and test flew, and so by the middle of 1969, the F-104S entered into Italian Air Force service. And what made it different and special? By this point, Lockheed, and Fiat for that matter, had plenty of time to learn from earlier models, and engine technology had really progressed. It still uses the J79, but it is a different, improved model with a lot more thrust. It was much faster in a climb. It could reach altitudes much faster than the G. It could also carry more payload. The earlier Starfighters had a total of 5 hard points. That would go up to 7, and then eventually this model here, because it was designed to be an interceptor, would have 9. Although in practice, they never used all of them at all. But theoretically, you had the wingtip rails, which could be used for the fuel tanks. You had 2 hard points each under each wing, one of which could be used for a fuel tank too. And then you had 3 under the fuselage, 2 originally kind of the side-by-side you see on the A, and a center line optional. This had in fact, it had the most advanced radar of any starfighter in 1966-68, giving it more abilities, and so it could work with newer ordnance. Its primary missiles for air-to-air were the AIM-7 Sparrow, used by the F-4 as well as the F-14 Tomcat, and even later the F-15. And it could carry 2 of them. These are medium-range, beyond visual range missiles. You can see them on this model here. It could also carry the AIM-9 Sidewinder, which was becoming very ubiquitous by this point. It would start off carrying the B, and then later it would go to the AIM-9F updated one. And typically it could carry 2 and 2, although sometimes it could carry 4 Sidewinders. And in theory, it could carry 6, but it doesn't seem like it ever did. They could carry 2 under each wing, and then the wing tip rails. Now this model here comes with some optional ordnance. I have it configured with 2 AIM-7s. This is kind of a bomber intercept configuration. With the fuel tanks, because without them, it has about 2 minutes range. It also came with a couple of AIM-9s. These are the updated L's, but we'll get to that in a minute. So, on a normal patrol, it would actually carry 1 of each, 1 Sparrow, 1 AIM-9. Or it could just carry all AIM-9s if the mission called for it. So that was its primary role, air-to-air interceptor. Mostly they were thinking bombers. This was Europe in the 1960s into the 70s. But it had a secondary ground attack role. In fact, it was one of the more capable ones. It could carry nearly twice the payload as the F-104G. And it could use, at least in theory, up to 7 of its hard points for bombs, with only the wing tip rails not being available. In practice, it would never really carry more than 4 bombs, but theory was there. Again, those center line hard points they really didn't use. Part of it was some of the equipment for the Sparrow missile had to be stored there. Also, to make room for the radar and the equipment that it needed, they took out the cannon. The M61 went away with the 104S. And it had several other updates. To go with the new engine, they increased the size of the intakes just a slight bit. And there are some different patterns of antennae and sensors that you'd expect. Some are on this model, some aren't. You know, some are just so small. But between 1969 and 1979, FIAT would deliver 205 of these to the Italian Air Force. They actually built 206, but one of them was lost during a crash before it could go to the Air Force. And actually, it was in 1974 that Turkey first became interested and acquired their first 104Ss. Ultimately, 40 would be built for Turkey, plus another 18 surplus to needs ones would be given to Turkey. And I don't believe they ever did a two-seat version of the 104S. If I'm wrong, please correct me. Could very well be. But I know they continued to use the TF-104G as a two-seat trainer here. So that's what Italy was doing. It gave them a interceptor. But thanks to the new engine, it could sustain Mach 2.2. It still had very good climb, high altitude. And then the new radar made it much more capable. But it still didn't have a perfect safety record. It was still a kind of little bit of a temperamental craft. So much so that around 1986, an upgrade program was instituted, known as the F-104S ASA. This was a weapons update. They would introduce a new radar that was truly all-weather and had look-down, shoot-down capabilities. And it was compatible with a newer form of missile known as the ASPID. But it was still compatible with the AIM-7, and that seems to be in practice what it still carried. And it was compatible with the newer AIM-9L Sidewinder. And these would not be new production craft, but 147 would be taken in for updates. They would change a few other things, but it was mostly weapons configuration. And these would be done by the early 90s. And they were hoping to replace these, but the Eurofighter was delayed. If you look at the politics of Europe at the time, a lot was going on. The ending of the Cold War meant there were budget cuts. Therefore, in the mid-90s, another upgrade program was scheduled, known as the F-104S ASAM. And this was done to improve reliability, safety, and have some compatibility with newer technologies, for example, GPS. It also went to a newer Martin Baker ejection seat. And they finally just deleted those 3 centerline hardpoints that they never used anyway. They pulled the wiring out for them and everything, just to get rid of them. And they would update 49 F-104Ss to the new standard, and actually 15 of the older TF-104G trainers. So by the 21st century, there weren't really any originals still flying. And Turkey had started to retire theirs as well. But again, because of delays, actually ultimately what Italy had to do was get some tornadoes from Britain to kind of fill the gap as these were aging out. I mean, at this point, these aircraft were at the youngest 20 years old, and some of them were approaching 30. And many had been lost to attrition and crashes and accidents. And eventually they just had to retire these. And this model here is actually from its retirement in October of 2004. The last flight of an Italian Starfighter was actually in 2005, but that was a TF-104G. The last flight of an F-104S variant was in the previous year, and that's what we have here. And I just thought this would be a neat model because it does have the different engine exhaust. And it does have, although it's probably not viewable on camera, the air intakes here are slightly bigger. And it has the added hard points under the wings. The other ones, like the G, there were only 2 underwing hard points. Again, this one had 4. And while you could carry the AIM-9 Sidewinder on the tip rails, in practice it was almost always fuel tanks, except for maybe static display or air shows or what have you. It's also worth pointing out that there were versions made initially for kind of specializing in ground attack, and then of course there was the version here that was an interceptor, and they were made in such a way that they could be switched back and forth. But they pretty much dropped the whole ground attack. By the time you get to the ASAM series, they were all air-to-air interceptor type planes. And yeah, just thought it was kind of neat. I just really like the Starfighter. It's a very futuristic, very weird looking plane. And these are great for collecting because they don't take up a whole lot of space on the shelf. They're long, but very narrow. And they're pretty much all metal. Wings, body. The tail starts to become plastic towards the top because it's so thin. But the wings are still metal. And they stay on their stand real well. The stands plug into 2 holes. They're not just sitting on there. And of course these missiles and tanks are removable. There's different configurations. There's also a neat U.S. Air Force F-104C, as seen in Vietnam. And so this one's much like the A over there. Again, you can see the added underwing points for the medium-range missiles, fuel tanks. I was kind of wondering when I got this about why there wasn't any centerline ordnance, and then of course I read that, yeah, they did away with it. So by 2004, when this was flying, they would not had those anymore. One neat thing, they did actually include the correct ejection seat in here. Always neat. And another nice thing, the PIAT tube plugs in. It doesn't come installed. And they actually give you a spare, so if you happen to bend this long piece or break it off, you get a spare. So, and not bad. Not bad at all. And of course, gear up or down, and the canopy open, close, pilot in, out. The usual Hobby Master features. But yeah, since they announced this, I've been pretty excited because while you can get 172 scale 104Ss, they're not Hobby Masters. And, yeah, just nicer. I have to say this one, the 104A, is a limited edition for the Taiwanese market. And, pretty collectible. And I got this thanks to Pete's Collectibles. And when I realized it was a rare one, I told him he didn't have to, sell it. You can put it on eBay or whatever and get what you want out of it. But he said no. So I paid just normal price at the time for a Starfighter. I don't know, $50. And again, this one just came out in March of 2021. By this point, prices have gone up because, of course, they have. And nothing's cheap anymore. So what do you think? I'm going to keep knocking that off. Well, begin the video with the tank falling off. End the video with the tank falling off. It is fearful symmetry. Anyway, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. And please, if you have anything, comment below. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.